Hi everyone, it's Nathaniel again. So it's been a while since I've posted anything, and this return back is following having read Cormac McCarthy's The Passenger. This is his latest book. Ever since his last book was The Road about 16 years ago, and so this has been extremely long awaited. And having finished it a couple of days ago, giving myself a chance to think a little bit more about what I read, I want to talk about some of the points that I think are particularly important. Um, First off, I hope to not have any spoilers in this story. I don't know that you can really say that there are spoilers concerning this, and this is not going to be a true deep dive into the book. However, I do want to touch upon some things to keep in mind if you do happen to pick up this book and are starting to go through it, because the more I think about it, the more I realize this book is definitely going to be something talked about in college literature courses. Um, I don't think that Cormac McCarthy is a writer for everyone. I think that it takes a little bit of time to get used to him. I know that a lot of people really appreciate him. I know that there's a channel called Right Conscious. He talks a lot about Cormac McCarthy's things, and if you have any interest in looking a little bit more into Cormac McCarthy, then you should check out Right Conscious on YouTube. When I was introduced to Cormac McCarthy, it was through Blood Meridian back in, I don't know, 96 or something like that. And my professor told us how his colleagues had teased him about doing such a heavy book for a low-level literature course, and that he should really have done All the Pretty Horses, because a lot of people found All the Pretty Horses to be one of the, if not the, American novel. And we read the Blood Meridian, and I thought, I didn't really care for it. I didn't particularly like Cormac McCarthy's style. Um, and then I decided to try All the Pretty Horses. I think I had already seen the movie with Matt Damon and thought that it was all right. It wasn't anything, it wasn't exciting to me, but I thought I would try out the book. And this was also around the time that I had read like 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I read All the Pretty Horses. And again, I was just very underwhelmed. I found it to be dry, a little bit slow, definitely short on description. And so I just kind of put it away. And then in 2006, The Road had come out and had been getting some acclaim, and then Oprah put it onto her book club. And at the time, I had been reading Oprah book club selections quite a bit, and that was where I really got through a lot of Toni Morrison books at the time, was because of Oprah, believe it or not. And so I picked up The Road, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. His style, his austere way of describing things fit perfectly with the story. And I've since reread The Road at least one time, and of course I saw the movie, which, in my personal opinion, they should have done the whole movie in black and white, because that's the way that the book reads. But I was blown away by The Road, and I realized that I finally had started to understand what Cormac McCarthy's style was. I understood his voice a little bit more, if that makes sense. So I reread Blood Meridian and All the Pretty Horses, and now I appreciated them. I didn't love them. They didn't grasp me the same way that The Road did, but I enjoyed them. And then No Country for Old Men came out, and I read that one and very much enjoyed that one. The movie is a great adaptation and follows the story almost to the letter. There's just a minor change towards the end that doesn't affect the progression or anything like that. And of course, the portrayals in the movie are phenomenal. So I really, at that point, it's not that I became a huge Cormac McCarthy fan. I'm not going back to read his backlist or anything like that. They don't particularly interest me. So my excitement over The Passenger coming out is really tied more to, I wanted to see what he has done over these 16 years of absence. And because I liked No Country for Old Men and The Road so much, so I picked up The Passenger. And I'm not a fast reader. It takes me a while. And as I was going through this, I was thinking, okay, I can see why this, is not going to appeal to a wider audience. I think that because of my own particular mindset, which is not in the happiest places, to be honest, I think that that played a role in how I could take in the book. I think that if you read the synopsis and you hear about how Bobby Western and his crew have gone into this lake where there is this downed aircraft that has not been opened, but they get inside, everyone's dead, the black box is missing, and then it turns out that there's someone missing from the manifest. You think that this story is going to be about that thing, but it is not. It's not at all. And the passenger, it alludes to the idea of this missing passenger from the plane, but the reality, and this of course is my own personal take on the overall story, the passenger is Bobby Western. The passenger is the individual that is going through this story. Now, if you haven't already heard, the Passenger is just the first of two books that are coming out. The second one's coming out at the beginning of December, called Stella Maris, and it really is about Bobby Western's sister, Alicia, who has been in a mental institution, which is the Stella Maris. And so the way that this book is structured, it goes back and forth for most of the book between Alicia interacting with the kid, who is essentially a hallucination of hers, and then to Bobby's story. Now, I'm going to go through some of the characters and how the progression of the story starts getting related, because I've also already heard people say that not everything is tied together. You know, if you're wanting a clear resolution in the end, then you're not going to get that. And I am here to disagree with that assessment. So to take a side note and talk about Alicia. Alicia, if you look at her progression as a Alice in Wonderland story, it very much is what it is. She has gone down the rabbit hole. She is a brilliant individual. How do I say this? She is a math genius. Their father was one of the makers of the atomic bomb, and she has clearly pulled in, some of that genetic capability when it comes to numbers. But she is also mentally unwell, and she begins to get visited by the kid, who, with a myriad group of odd and strange characters, presents himself very much, as I said, like the story of Alice in Wonderland. He refuses to call her by her name. He's always using just different little epithets and, teasing names and things like that. They call him the formaldehyde kid on a couple of occasions, which of course harkens back to the drug that women were given many years ago, several decades ago, and it caused extreme birth defects. So he has flippers for hands, he has a colloidal head, and he's very short as well, stunted. But he basically puts on a carnival show for her at different times, and he's very impatient, is always trying to push forward. And so if you start looking at their interaction almost as how Alice had to interact with the different characters throughout Wonderland, you start realizing that the riddles that are being posed, the little displays of activity that go on, are very similar to Lewis Carroll's Wonderland. And they even get into a point where, the kid kind of chastises her about her lessons, that, with religion she only got a B. But, there's a scene in Alice in Wonderland where she has to recite, some lessons and things like that. But it just, the more I continued on, the more I kept thinking of those characters from Wonderland. And like I said, she is mentally unwell. But one of the interesting pieces is that the kid comes to Bobby Western later on in the book. So this idea of it simply being in her head, just a hallucination that has conjured from her mental wellness, it has transposed itself over into Bobby. And I think that it's explained in there, because at one point, let me pull this out. I don't usually mark my books, and so sometimes it's hard for me to go back and find these. But anyway, she asks the kid, how he got there, and he says that he took the bus. And she says, were there other people on the bus? And he says, sure, why not? And no one said anything. Like what? You didn't get any funny looks. Funny looks. Could they see you? The other passengers? Yes. Who knows? Jesus. Probably some could and some couldn't. Some could, but wouldn't. Where's this going? What kind of passenger can see you? How did we get stuck on this passenger thing? I just want to know. Ask me again. What kind of passenger is it that can see you? I think I know what we've got here. Okay, what kind of passenger? The kid stuck what would have been his thumbs in his earlobes and waggled his flippers and rolled his eyes and went babble, abble, abble. She put one hand over her mouth. I'm just jacking with you. I don't know what kind of passenger. Jesus. People will look at you and they look surprised. That's all. Who do they think you are? I don't know. Christ. I guess they think I'm a passenger. Of course, you can make the case that if they're passengers, then I must be something else. But maybe not. I can't speak for them. Maybe they just see a small but pleasant fellow of no determinate age, receding hairline. So the fact that Bobby Western is able to see him and talk to him um, later on in the story is talking about this scene. Who can see you, and she points out, or he points out rather, to Alicia that some people can but won't. They choose not to. And what it is I think, and of course, further readings and further study of this story would probably go into it a lot better, but I think that there's always something there because, and there's a conversation towards the end of the book that talks about how our joys are all different, but we share a similar sorrow. And I think that that is really what is happening here, is that the people that could see you or could see the kid, this hallucination, this unwellness, choose not to. They're going along as with blinders, and they're all passengers on the bus, but some of them just choose not to see this sorrow or this anguish or this difficulty that Alicia is so tapped into, and that ultimately leads her to taking her own life. And then I want to also talk, going back over to Bobby, who is the passenger for this book. He has several groups, or a group of friends. They're mostly not connected to one another. Some of them know of one another, but they, if nothing else, this is a book of conversations and big ideas. And even though Cormac McCarthy goes into the JFK assassination and quantum mechanics and even some of the issues with Vietnam, it's really not about those subjects. It's more about the ideas that are really being talked about in these conversations, and ultimately how some of this, conscientious aspect of, like, the sins of the father being played on their children plays out in through all this. Now, Bobby, as a passenger, it must be said that he is the most inactive participant in his own story. And so I want to talk briefly just about four of his people. The first one, and the shortest lived, is named Euler. Euler is one of his dive buddies. They go in, they're the ones that go into the airplane. They go on to another tug later on, and Euler talks about some of Bobby's fears, because Bobby doesn't really like some of the depths and things like that. He doesn't like being in close places. And Euler relates a story about his time in Vietnam and how really sometimes you just get to the point where you don't think about what is going on, or if you do, then you acknowledge it in sort of an abstract way. And he's trying, as all of Bobby's friends really do try, to get him to acknowledge his own difficulties but move past them, right? Well, once all of that has been said, Euler goes down to Venezuela for a job and dies. So Cormac McCarthy is done with this character. He has said what he needs to say, and he has put him away, right? So then I want to get to Sheddan. Sheddan? I think that's how you say it. Sheddan is an older man that Bobby interacts with on various occasions, and they have a lot of conversations, and Sheddan refers to Bobby as Squire. And Sheddan has sort of a sordid past, as we can tell. But he serves in many ways as Bobby's psychoanalyst. He even has the cigar, right? So he is Bobby's Freud, and they talk about a variety of things. But ultimately, Bobby goes away at one point, sort of in an exile, in trying to find himself, because he has some shady characters and something about the government that is coming after him. And he doesn't know entirely why, but he is going to have to go on the run, but he hasn't yet done so. And I'll talk a little bit more about that with another one of these characters. But when he comes back, he learns that Sheddan has died, and Sheddan has left him a letter. The letter is, again, a call to action. It's really him saying, we understand, as your friends, as people who you interact with, we understand the difficulty that you have gone through. It's different than what we have gone through. And we don't understand why you choose to keep going through this pain that you have inflicted on yourself. Because there's a lot of regret in Bobby for Alicia's death and the loss of her, because he very much loved his sister. And so the idea of Sheddan as his Freud, as his psychoanalyst, and him trying to give him advice at different things. Sheddan is the one character that regularly is saying what is going on inside Bobby's mind or his actions. And he relates those sometimes to side characters that happen to be present, but he also is revealing those to Bobby. And one of the last interactions that they had, as Bobby left, Sheddan even turns to the person that's with him and says, "Do you think he's going to follow my advice? Or do you think he'd really listen to me?" And the person says, "I don't know." And Sheddan says, "Well, I sure hope so." So he is absolutely the one that is looking at Bobby the closest, right? And then I want to move on to Kline, who is an attorney that Bobby goes to once his assets start getting seized by the government. And he, at various times, they meet up. And he's an older guy. He worked with Bobby Kennedy at some point, and he relates this whole story about some of the, the things that the Kennedys were involved in, and he goes into kind of a long monologue about the whole assassination and how it couldn't have been Oswald and everything like that. But ultimately, Kline serves as not a conscience like what Sheddan does, but he serves as this, how do you say, he serves, he's very much the realist, I guess you could say. He is the one that is very much encouraging Bobby to get a new identity. You have to change yourself. You have to get away. You will be going to jail. They will not stop. If you continue to choose to be inactive in your life, it will fall down all around you. And at some point, you just have to make the choice to change. And it even says that if you want to get through this, you have to become someone. And he makes that point over and over again. And I think that some of the conversations that he has when they're sitting there and they're looking kind of at the guy who's connected to the mafia and they're talking about the assassination, I think that he's really pounding that point into Bobby, that you have to be the active person in your life. You have to be the one that ultimately chooses to become someone else. That leads in to Debbie. Now, Debbie is one of the first conversations that we really have in the book with Bobby and one of his friends. Debbie is a male to female transgender. She is fully living her life as a female now, but she hasn't yet undergone the surgery that will convert her into the female form, or fully into the form. And she very much wants this. She wants to be female. She wants to have everything about her to be female. She was born William, and when she revealed her transition to her mother, it was very difficult, but she was welcomed by her younger sister. Now, when you look at these two characters, how does this character play a role? Well, she is Bobby's, for lack of a better word, heart. She is the one who, she loves him. She is willing to do for him. She's not just a buddy. Like everyone else, serves as a buddy. And they all, yes, they care about Bobby and what happens to him, but she is the only one who loves him. And the first conversation, as they're about to say goodbye, she turns to him and says, "I never asked you what you wanted from me." And it's implying that all these people that surround Debbie are people who, of course, want something from her. She refers to herself as a big star. Every time they go out, people are always looking at them and her specifically. She's a imposing character. But she says to him, "I never asked you what you wanted from me." Well, she ends up being the one that in the end he goes to because he has this final letter from his sister that he has decided never to read. But he needs to get into it. And he goes to Debbie to read the story that his sister has left behind so that he can find out about where this violin is, whether she has any other bank accounts, because he has finally decided he's going to become someone else and he's going to leave. But he can't look at the story, or he can't look at the letter himself. So he goes to Debbie and he even says, "I need you to read this letter and I need you to tell me if this information is in there. You don't need to tell me, the rest of it." And he even says to her, "I have no one else that I can turn to for this." Because even with these other characters, she is also the one that he loves the most, that he actually trusts the most intimately. So she reads the letter, and it's devastating. We don't know what the letter is. Maybe in Stella Maris it will talk about that because it's from Alicia's point of view, and I suspect that the letter is in there. I would be surprised that it's not. But it has pervaded throughout the whole book. We know that this letter is there. We know that Bobby has refused to read it. We know that he needs to get into it so that he can move on with his life. But he chooses not to. He chooses to have Debbie take on the content of that letter. And it causes her to break down. She cries a lot to the point where, her makeup gets messed up and everything, and she has to fix that later on. And even the waiter asked, is everything okay? Did Bobby do something to you that, and so we know that this letter is devastating. So it has a lot of information, clearly. But I really thought that it was interesting that the first conversation that they have ends with, "You never ask anything of me." And the last conversation is him asking for that ultimate reveal. And then, of course, the story goes on, and Bobby has finally become someone else, has gone to some other place. And he moves on with his life. Now, I want to wrap it up with that. I do want to refer back to, there is one scene where he is in his exile and the kid comes to him, and the kid really doesn't reveal anything, but you get this idea that Bobby is finding himself going down that path that his sister did. And there are various times that he has discussed having wanted to kill himself, but he just doesn't do it because he's an inactive participant in his own life. He's just allowing things to go. He was good at math, but he wasn't as good as his sister, so he dropped out of physics. He was good at racing cars, but he wasn't good enough, so he got out of that and started doing diving. His diving, he had this sort of claustrophobia when it came to certain aspects, and then supposedly one of his friends, Euler, dies in a similar situation. So he keeps on doing all of these sort of just floating around. The government comes after him and just takes everything that he has. His friends start dying off. He goes into this exile, and even there, he actively starts taking the mice out because the place gets infected or infested with mice. But then after, emptying the traps, he gets rid of them. And what takes away the mice? Well, a weasel comes in and starts taking out the mice. And then whenever he scares off the weasel, the mice come back. And ultimately, he's like, I can't stay here anymore. So he's an inactive participant in his life. And his sister, who was actively choosing to do these different things, and which ultimately led to her actively choosing to kill herself, he can't go that far. And so finally, through all the different conversations that he's had and all of the different encouragements and everything, he finally does what he has needed to do this whole time, and that is become someone else and make a choice. And his friend Debbie, who is making the biggest change in individual, it's not just names and location, but she's changing her physical form to fit the needs of her mind. That person is the last one he talks to before he goes to this other place as this other person. And I think that that does wrap up the book. I think that that does come to a conclusion that you can understand. And I think that this book is going to be talked about for years. And I'm very curious how Stella Maris will play out. I imagine it as a sort of addendum to this book, but I hope that it has its own life. And I can see this book being talked about for years to come in academic circles. So if you've had a chance to read The Passenger, if you have any thoughts about what I've talked about, or if you are looking forward to reading it, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Because I would love to have more conversation with people who have gone through this story. Does it resonate with you? Do you feel some of that loneliness that Bobby does as he's going on? And I'm just really curious how people are taking on this book, because I think that the majority of people are going to read this and they're going to find it to either be boring or a little bit overwrought. And I just found it to be extremely full of things. And I think that subsequent readings will really bring more out of it. So I guess that's it. Like I said, if you have any comments or questions or anything like that, please put them into the comments. Yeah, I said that. If you have any comments, please put them in the comment section below. And until next time, have a good day. Bye.